There is a place in the mountains of northern Peru where the clouds do not pass overhead. They stop. They settle into the valleys and the forests and the narrow ridgelines like something that has decided to stay, like something that has found in this particular fold of the Andes exactly the conditions it has always been looking for. The trees disappear into the white. The paths vanish. The stone walls of buildings that were old when the Inca Empire was young emerge from the mist, and then are swallowed again, visible for a moment, gone the next. The people who lived here, who built their cities in this cloud, called themselves something that history has not perfectly preserved. We know them by the name their enemies gave them, the Chachapoya. In the language of the Inca, who eventually conquered them, or tried to, the name means, roughly, people of the clouds, warriors of the mist, the ones who lived where the sky meets the earth and made that impossible place their home. The Chachapoya are not famous. You will not find them in most history textbooks. Their name does not appear in the standard narratives of pre-Columbian America, dominated as those narratives are by the Aztecs and the Maya and the Inca, the civilizations that European eyes encountered first, that left the most dramatic ruins, that generated the most documentation in the colonial period. The Chachapoya left something different. They left cities built on the edges of cliffs so sheer that modern archaeologists attempting to reach them require ropes and climbing equipment. They left circular stone towers perched on ridgelines above the cloud layer, their walls decorated with geometric patterns of extraordinary precision, visible for miles on the rare days when the cloud clears. They left mummies, dozens, hundreds of mummies, preserved in cliff tombs at heights so exposed and so difficult to access that the only explanation for their presence is that someone carried the dead up those rock faces deliberately as an act of devotion so profound it defied the terrain itself. They left a mystery, a real one, not the constructed mystery of popular archaeology, not the who built this and why do mainstream archaeologists ignore it genre of question that fills a certain kind of documentary. A genuine historical mystery born of real evidence, sustained by real uncertainty, and being answered slowly, carefully, one fieldwork season at a time, by real archaeologists working in some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. This is the story of the Chachapoya, the people the clouds kept secret for 500 years, and the world that the mist is slowly giving back. To understand the Chachapoya, you must first understand where they lived, and where they lived is unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. The Peruvian cloud forest, the Selva Alta, the high jungle, occupies a narrow band of altitude on the eastern slopes of the Andes, roughly between 1,500 and 3,500 meters above sea level. Below it, the Amazon basin stretches to the east in an unbroken green expanse, warm and wet and dense with life. Above it, the high Andean Puna, the cold, treeless grasslands of the Altiplano, extends toward the peaks and the ice. Between these two worlds, the cloud forest occupies a zone of extraordinary ecological richness and extraordinary climatic strangeness. The mechanism that creates it is elegant in its simplicity. Warm, moisture-laden air rises from the Amazon basin, pushed upward by the Andean slopes. As it rises, it cools. Cool air holds less moisture than warm air, and so the moisture condenses. Not into rain exactly, but into cloud, into the persistent, dense mist that settles into the valleys and ridges of the eastern Andes and refuses to leave. The result is an ecosystem that exists in a state of permanent moisture. The trees are covered in moss, deep, dense, layered moss that coats every surface and hangs from every branch in curtains that sway in the lightest air movement. Bromeliads anchor themselves in the forks of branches, collecting pools of water in their leaves that become entire ecosystems, microhabitats hosting insects and frogs and organisms found nowhere else. Orchids grow in profusion. The cloud forest of northern Peru is one of the most orchid-rich environments on Earth, with species found in single valleys that exist nowhere else in the world. The visibility in the cloud forest can drop to a few meters. Not in fog exactly. You are inside the cloud, and the distinction between fog and cloud is purely one of altitude. The light is filtered and soft and directionless, arriving from no specific source, illuminating everything equally and therefore casting no shadows. Sound travels differently in this moisture-laden air. The calls of birds and the cloud forest of northern Peru is extraordinarily rich in birds, including many found nowhere else, seem to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It is a beautiful place. It is also a disorienting one. For the ancient peoples of the central Andes, the civilizations of the coast and the high plain, accustomed to the harsh clarity of desert and puna, the cloud forest was the edge of the known world, the place where the familiar rules of landscape and navigation stopped applying, where you could lose yourself in the white. The Chachapoya chose this place, not because they had no other option. The archaeological evidence suggests a sophisticated people who understood their landscape deeply and made deliberate choices about where to build, where to plant, where to place their dead. The cloud forest was not a refuge of last resort. It was home, chosen, understood, inhabited with the expertise of generations. The territory of the Chachapoya culture, as defined by the distribution of their characteristic archaeological sites, covers approximately 90,000 square kilometers of northern Peru, centered on the modern regions of Amazonas and San Martin. This is roughly the size of Portugal or of the state of Indiana, a substantial territory large enough to encompass enormous ecological and climatic variety. Within this territory, the Chachapoya built settlements at altitudes ranging from around 2,000 to over 3,000 meters. They farmed the mountain slopes, terracing them with the characteristic precision of Andean agricultural engineering. They hunted the cloud forest, they traded with the peoples of the Amazon basin below and the high Andes above, and they built. The buildings they left behind, the circular stone structures that dot the ridgelines and cliff faces of their territory, are the most immediately recognizable signature of Chachapoya culture. Not because circular buildings are unique in the pre-Columbian world, but because of where they were built and how they were built and what they were decorated with, and because some of them, after 800 years of cloud and mist and occasional earthquake, are still standing. There is a building in the mountains of Amazonas that most people have never heard of. It should be famous. By any reasonable measure of scale and ambition and historical significance, it should be one of the most visited and most discussed archaeological sites in the Americas. Instead, it sits in the cloud forest of northern Peru, reached by a cable car that was only completed in 2017, visited by a fraction of the tourists who crowd Machu Picchu 500 kilometers to the south. It is called Kuelap, and it is extraordinary. The site sits on a narrow ridgeline at approximately 3,000 meters altitude above the valley of the Utcubamba River, a valley so deep that standing on the ridge and looking down, the river is barely visible, a thin silver thread at the bottom of a trench that seems to go on forever. The walls of Kuelap rise from this ridgeline with a presence that is difficult to describe without recourse to words that risk sounding like exaggeration. They are 19 meters tall. Not the buildings inside the walls, the perimeter walls themselves. The defensive enclosure that defines the site rise 19 meters from the mountain's slope, constructed from limestone blocks fitted together without mortar, with a precision that has allowed them to stand for more than 8 centuries in an environment of near constant moisture and occasional seismic activity. The perimeter wall encloses an area of approximately 450 meters in length by 110 meters in width, roughly 6 hectares of mountain ridgeline transformed into what is effectively an elevated platform on which the Chachapoya built their city. Inside the walls, approximately 400 circular stone structures of varying sizes, the largest at 20 meters in diameter, substantial buildings capable of housing extended family groups. Many are decorated on their exterior walls with the geometric friezes that are the most recognizable artistic signature of Chachapoya culture. Bands of diamond patterns, zigzag designs, and other geometric motifs running around the upper portion of the circular walls, executed in precisely fitted stone. The entry points to Kuelap are remarkable in themselves. 3 narrow passages pierce the great perimeter wall, each of them designed with deliberate constriction. The passages narrow as they penetrate the wall, becoming barely wide enough for a single person at their innermost point. Anyone attempting to enter Kuelap by force would have to do so in single file, at the mercy of defenders on the wall above. Kuelap was not merely a residential site, it was a fortified city. The decision to build 19-meter perimeter walls on a ridgeline at 3,000 meters altitude was not an aesthetic choice, it was a military one. The Chachapoya lived in a world of conflict. The evidence for warfare in their territory, fortified positions of their major sites, the skeletal trauma visible on some excavated individuals, the traditions of resistance recorded in Spanish colonial documents, is consistent and clear. They were not a peaceful people isolated from the violence of the Andean world. They were participants in it, and they built their cities accordingly. The construction of Kuelap required an effort of organization that is staggering to contemplate. The limestone blocks of the perimeter wall were quarried somewhere in the surrounding mountains, though the precise quarry sites have not been definitively identified, and transported to the ridgeline. In the absence of wheeled vehicles, which were not used in pre-Columbian America, and draft animals capable of pulling heavy loads up mountain terrain, the movement of these blocks required human labor on a massive scale. The total volume of stone in the Kuelap walls has been estimated at approximately 450 million cubic feet, more than the volume of stone in the Great Pyramid of Giza, though distributed differently. This comparison is sometimes made to suggest that Kuelap is more impressive than the pyramids, which is perhaps not quite the right way to think about it. They are different achievements in different contexts, but the comparison does convey something real about the scale of the undertaking. Who organized this labor? The Chachapoya did not have, as far as the evidence suggests, a centralized state apparatus comparable to the Inca Empire. Their political organization appears to have been more decentralized, a confederation of related groups sharing a common culture, each with its own local leadership, without a single paramount ruler coordinating everything from a capital city. How, then, was a project of this scale organized and sustained? The honest answer is, we do not fully know. What we know is that it was done. The walls stand, the city was built. The labor was organized somehow by people who left no written records of the arrangements they made, the decisions they took, the negotiations between communities that must have been required to assemble the workforce that raised those walls. The mystery of Kuelap's construction is, in this sense, a mystery about social organization, about how a non-centralized society managed to produce a centralized monumental work. And it is a mystery that the available evidence has not yet resolved. Walk through Kuelap, or through any of the dozens of other Chachapoya sites scattered across their territory, and the most immediately striking feature is the uniformity of the circular building form. Everywhere, circles. In a pre-Columbian world where rectangular architecture was the dominant form, from the great enclosures of Inca Cuzco to the platform mounds of the coastal civilizations, the Chachapoya built round, always round. The circular plan was not a practical necessity imposed by the available building materials or the terrain. It was a choice, a consistent, persistent, culturally specific choice that the Chachapoya maintained across centuries and across the full geographic extent of their territory. Why round? The question has no definitive answer, but several lines of evidence suggest directions. In many cultures worldwide, the circular building form carries cosmological associations. The circle as symbol of completeness, of the sun, of the cycles of time and life. The specific associations in Chachapoya culture are not directly accessible to us. They left no written texts, and the colonial-era documents that describe their practices are filtered through Spanish eyes and shaped by Spanish concerns. But the consistency of the circular form across the entire cultural area, maintained over centuries, suggests that it was not merely practical, but meaningful. The decoration of the circular buildings provides another clue to their cultural significance. The geometric friezes that run around the upper walls of Chachapoya buildings, particularly well preserved at Kuelap and at several other major sites, are among the most visually striking elements of the archaeological record. These friezes were not painted, they were constructed. Individual stones fitted together to create patterns in the wall surface itself. The relief of the design emerging from the varying projection of precisely placed stones. The patterns are geometric: diamonds, zigzags, stepped frets, rhombuses arranged in repeating sequences. They are similar enough across sites to suggest a shared design vocabulary, a visual language that all Chachapoya communities understood and deployed, while varying enough in their specific arrangements to suggest local creativity within the shared framework. The precision required to execute these friezes in stone, where a single, misplaced block would disrupt the pattern, and where correction would require dismantling and rebuilding, speaks to a masonry tradition of considerable sophistication. These were not apprentice works, they were the product of craftsmen who had mastered a complex technical and aesthetic tradition. The interior organization of Chachapoya circular buildings has been studied at several sites where excavation has been possible. The buildings typically have a single doorway, facing in a consistent direction at any given site, suggesting that orientation was deliberate and significant. Inside, the floor space was organized around a central hearth. Sleeping and working areas were arranged around the perimeter. Storage facilities, ceramic vessels, organic containers were kept against the walls or in small niches built into the wall thickness. These were family homes. The scale of the largest buildings, 20 meters in diameter, with a floor area of more than 300 square meters, was sufficient to house an extended family comfortably, with space for the various activities of daily domestic life. The ceramic vessels found inside Chachapoya buildings reveal something about how people lived. The pottery is distinctive, decorated with specific motifs, made in forms not found in neighboring cultures, and it shows the variety of uses to which ceramics were put: cooking, storage, serving food and drink, ritual use. Animal bones in the midden deposits. The ancient rubbish heaps that are among an archaeologist's most informative data sources show that the Chachapoya ate camelids, llamas and alpacas, guinea pigs, deer, and a variety of birds. They cultivated maize, potatoes, and other Andean crops on the terraced slopes below their settlements. They collected wild plants from the cloud forest. This was not a subsistence-level civilization barely getting by at the edge of the habitable world. It was a prosperous, well-fed, culturally rich society that had made the cloud forest not merely survivable, but comfortable. There is a cliff face in the mountains of Amazonas where the dead stand watch, not metaphorically, literally. On a vertical rock face high above the Utcubamba Valley, accessible only by a narrow path that requires hands as well as feet to navigate, a row of figures stands in niches cut into the cliff. Each figure is roughly 2 meters tall, rendered in the form of a human body. A torso, a head, features that suggest a face looking outward, constructed from a mixture of clay and organic materials over a wooden internal framework. These are the Puran Machu of Karagia, the cliff sarcophagi of the Chachapoya, and they are among the most haunting and most extraordinary funerary monuments in the Americas. The sarcophagi of Karagia were discovered by the wider world in 1985, when a Peruvian archaeologist named Federico Kaufmann Doig encountered them during fieldwork in the region. They had been known to local communities for far longer. They are visible from the valley below, for those who know where to look. But their existence had not entered the international archaeological literature. What Kaufmann Doig found was a row of 8 sarcophagi standing in niches on the cliff face, approximately 50 meters above the valley floor. 6 of the original figures were intact. 2 had fallen, destroyed by either earthquake or the determined efforts of looters attracted by the mummies preserved inside. The surviving sarcophagi are constructed with remarkable skill. The outer shell, shaped to suggest a human form with exaggerated features, is made from a mixture of clay, grasses, and other organic material, applied over a wooden framework and shaped into the characteristic elongated body with its large, forward-facing head. The heads of some figures bear what appear to be additional skulls placed on top of the constructed head, a detail whose significance is debated, but that clearly marks these individuals as people of exceptional status. Inside each sarcophagus, preserved by the remarkable drying properties of the cliff environment, were the mummified remains of the individuals being honored. The placement of the sarcophagi on the cliff face was not random. It was chosen with evident deliberateness, a location where the figures would be visible from the valley below, where they would be exposed to the sky and the wind, where they would look outward over the landscape that their community had inhabited in life. The Chachapoya placed their honored dead in positions of surveillance, not hidden in the earth, not enclosed in underground chambers. Standing on the cliff face, looking at the world, continuing, in some conceptual sense, to watch over the community they had belonged to. This funerary practice reflects a relationship between the living and the dead that is common across many Andean cultures, but expressed here in a particularly dramatic form. The dead were not gone. They were present. They continued to be members of the community, to be consulted and honored and appealed to be offered food and drink and the other goods they would need to maintain their existence in whatever state followed physical death. The specific beliefs of the Chachapoya about death and the afterlife are not directly accessible to us. Again, no written records, and the Spanish colonial documents are filtered and incomplete. But the physical evidence of their funerary practice speaks clearly enough about the general framework. Death was a transition, not an ending, and the proper honoring of the dead required placing them in positions where they could continue to interact with the world of the living. The cliff face, high above the valley, exposed to the sky. This was not a hiding place for the dead, it was a throne. In 1996, a group of local treasure hunters in the cloud forest of northern Peru followed a path that led them to a lake. The lake, Laguna de los Condores, the Lake of the Condors, sat at about 2,800 meters altitude in a remote valley accessible only by several days of difficult travel through the cloud forest. It was the kind of place that only people with specific knowledge of the terrain would know about. Beautiful in the way that remote mountain lakes are beautiful. Still water reflecting the cloud that perpetually surrounded it. The forest pressing close on every side. And on the cliff face above the lake's southern shore, the treasure hunters found what they were looking for, and something far more significant than anything they had imagined. A series of mausolea built into niches in the cliff, 6 separate burial chambers, each accessible only with climbing equipment, each containing the mummified remains of multiple individuals, along with extraordinary quantities of associated artifacts. The discovery was, by any measure, one of the most significant archaeological finds in Peru in decades. It was also immediately a crisis. The treasure hunters, recognizing the value of what they had found, began removing artifacts. Mummies were disturbed. The fragile, moisture-sensitive organic materials that the cliff environment had preserved for 5 centuries began to be exposed to handling and the open air. By the time word reached the Peruvian authorities and a rescue operation could be organized, significant damage had been done. The rescue excavation, conducted by a team from the Catholic University of Santa Maria and the National Geographic Society, led by archaeologist Federico Kaufmann-Doig, was one of the most logistically challenging operations in the history of Peruvian archaeology. Getting personnel and equipment to the site required helicopter support and extended trekking. Working on the cliff face required specialized climbing equipment. Preserving the materials being recovered required constant attention to humidity and temperature. What they found, despite the prior looting, was still extraordinary. More than 200 mummified individuals in varying states of preservation, their bodies wrapped in layers of fine textiles, cotton and camelid fiber woven in patterns that reflected both Chachapoya and Inca influences, evidence of the cultural entanglement that followed the Inca conquest of the region. Thousands of artifacts, ceramic vessels, wooden objects, basketry, metal ornaments, featherwork, and items of daily life preserved by the remarkable conditions of the cliff niche, the cool, dry air that the overhanging rock maintained within the chambers, limiting the biological activity that would otherwise rapidly destroy organic material. Quipus, the knotted string recording devices of the Inca world, several of which showed characteristics that suggested they might be Chachapoya quipus rather than purely Inca ones, raising fascinating questions about the recording practices of the pre-conquest Chachapoya. And the textiles. The textiles recovered from Laguna de los Condores are among the finest surviving examples of Andean weaving from any pre-Columbian context. Woven from the fiber of alpacas raised at high altitude, fiber of extraordinary fineness and quality, the textiles display patterns of considerable complexity, executed with a precision that required looms of sophisticated design and weavers of exceptional skill. The colors, despite 5 centuries in the cliff environment, retained much of their original vividness, testimony to the quality of the natural dyes used and the excellence of the dyeing technique. The individuals buried at Laguna de los Condores were not randomly selected members of the Chachapoya population. The quantity and quality of the grave goods, the fine textiles, the metal ornaments, the elaborately decorated ceramics, and the evident effort required to place the burials in this remote, difficult-to-access location suggest that these were people of significant social status. Some of the mummies showed evidence of artificial cranial modification, the deliberate reshaping of the skull in infancy by binding the head while the bones were still soft to produce a characteristically elongated or flattened cranial form. This practice, widespread across Andean cultures, was both a marker of cultural identity and, in some contexts, a marker of elite status. The mummies also showed in their bone and tissue evidence of the physical lives their subjects had led. Some showed signs of healed injuries, fractures that had knitted during the individual's lifetime, testimony to the physical demands and occasional violence of Chachapoya existence. Some showed pathologies associated with specific activities, as skeletal signatures of people who had carried heavy loads, who had spent hours in postures associated with weaving or pottery making, who had lived lives of sustained physical labor. These were real people, people with names that history did not preserve, with relationships and histories and the accumulated experiences of lives lived in the cloud forest above the Lake of the Condors. The mummies recovered from Laguna de los Condores are now housed in the Lemebamba Museum, a museum built specifically to house and study these materials in the town closest to the discovery site, run in partnership with the local community. It is one of the best community archaeology museums in South America, a model of how archaeological finds can be preserved and interpreted in ways that benefit the communities in whose territory they were made. One of the most discussed and most controversial aspects of Chachapoya archaeology is the physical appearance of the people themselves. The Spanish colonial chronicles that mention the Chachapoya, written in the decades after the conquest, drawing on the accounts of people who had encountered them or their immediate descendants, describe the Chachapoya in terms that have generated considerable discussion. The chronicler Cieza de Leon, writing in the mid-16th century, described the Chachapoya as the most handsome of all the Indians he had encountered, noting that the women were exceptionally beautiful and that both men and women were notably white, más blancos que todos los indios que he visto, whiter than all the Indians he had seen. This description has been seized upon by some writers to suggest that the Chachapoya were not indigenous Americans at all, that they were somehow of European or even Polynesian origin, placed in the Andes by migrations or contacts that conventional history has missed. These theories are not supported by the evidence and reflect a pattern of thought. The assumption that remarkable achievements must have European or other non-indigenous origins, that is both intellectually flawed and historically troubling. What the physical evidence actually shows is more interesting and less sensational. The mummies recovered from Chachapoya sites, including the Laguna de los Condores collection, have been subjected to various analyses, including examination of cranial morphology and, more recently, ancient DNA analysis. These analyses confirm that the Chachapoya were indigenous Americans, with genetic ancestry consistent with other South American indigenous populations. The characteristic described by Cieza de Leon, the lighter skin tone relative to other Andean peoples, probably reflects the specific altitude and UV exposure conditions of the cloud forest. People living at the altitude of the Chachapoya settlements, but within the persistent cloud cover that reduced UV radiation levels, would over generations develop skin pigmentation adapted to lower UV exposure, somewhat lighter than the skin of people living at similar altitudes, but with more sun exposure on the open puna. The cranial morphology of Chachapoya individuals shows the effects of artificial cranial modification, the deliberate head shaping practiced in infancy. But beneath the modification, the underlying cranial form is consistent with other South American indigenous populations. The Chachapoya were indigenous Andeans adapted to their specific environment, physically distinctive in the way that populations adapted to specific environments always are, but not the mysterious non-indigenous arrivals that some popular accounts have suggested. The linguistic evidence for the Chachapoya is fragmentary but revealing. The Chachapoya language, whatever it was, did not survive as a living language into the post-conquest period. By the time Spanish linguists and missionaries were systematically documenting the languages of Peru, Quechua, the language of the Inca, spread by imperial policy across the Andes, had replaced most local languages in the Chachapoya region. What survives are place names, the names of rivers, mountains, villages, and geographical features that were recorded by Spanish administrators and that preserve, in their sounds and structures, fragments of the pre-Quechua linguistic landscape. Analysis of these place names suggests that the Chachapoya language was related to other languages of the eastern Andean slopes, languages that were themselves not closely related to Quechua or to the languages of the Amazonian lowlands. The Chachapoya linguistic tradition may have been connected to a broader family of cloud forest languages, now largely extinct, whose relationship to other South American language families is not fully understood. The picture that emerges is of a people who were distinctly themselves, not simply a regional variant of the Inca world, not the mysterious, non-indigenous arrivals of popular myth, but an independent cultural tradition with its own language, its own architecture, its own funerary practices, its own artistic vocabulary, and its own history. A history that intersected, fatefully, with the expanding power of the Inca Empire in the 15th century. The Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, the four quarters of the world, was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, extending at its height from what is now southern Colombia to central Chile, from the Pacific coast to the Amazon basin. It was built through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic incorporation, and the systematic extension of Inca administrative, economic, and religious institutions across an enormous and ecologically diverse territory. The Inca came to the Chachapoya territory in the second half of the 15th century, probably during the reign of the Inca Tupac Inca Yupanqui, who ruled from approximately 1471 to 1493. The precise chronology of the conquest is uncertain, as it is for most events in the pre-literate Inca world, but the general outlines are preserved in both Inca oral tradition, recorded by Spanish chroniclers, and in the archaeological evidence. The Inca did not find the Chachapoya easy to conquer. The chronicles describe a prolonged and difficult campaign. The Chachapoya's cloud forest territory, their fortified ridgeline settlements, and their evident willingness to resist made them a far more challenging opponent than the open country peoples of the coast or the high plain. The Inca forces organized for warfare on the open terrain of the Puna found the cloud forest a difficult operational environment. The great fortified site of Kuelap, with its 19-meter walls and its commanding position above the Utcubamba Valley, must have presented a particularly daunting challenge. Whether the Inca ever actually besieged Kuelap directly, or whether Chachapoya resistance in the broader region was broken by other means, is not entirely clear from the available sources. What is clear is that Inca conquest of the region was achieved not in a single campaign, but through sustained military and diplomatic pressure over an extended period, and that Chachapoya resistance did not end with the initial conquest. The chronicles record multiple Chachapoya revolts against Inca authority, uprisings that were suppressed, sometimes with considerable violence, and that required the Inca to maintain a permanent military presence in the region. The Chachapoya reputation as warriors, the name by which they were known suggesting the Inca's own respect for their fighting capacity, was apparently well-founded. The Inca response to Chachapoya resistance included practices used across the empire to deal with troublesome subject peoples. Mitma, the forced relocation of populations. Groups of Chachapoya were removed from their home territory and resettled in other parts of the empire, their place taken by loyalist populations moved in from elsewhere. This policy was designed to disrupt the social networks and territorial attachments that sustained resistance, to separate people from the landscape and the communities that gave their resistance its coherence. Some Chachapoya groups were relocated to the Cusco region itself, to the heartland of the Inca Empire, where they could be more easily monitored and where their fighting skills could be directed in service of Inca military goals rather than against them. This relocation policy has left an unexpected legacy. There are communities in the Cusco region today whose oral traditions preserve a memory of Chachapoya ancestry, communities whose ancestors were moved there 500 years ago and who maintained, across the centuries, a sense of where they had come from. The Inca also incorporated Chachapoya cultural elements into the imperial system. Chachapoya-style architecture appears at some sites built under Inca authority in the region. The circular building forms, the geometric friezes, elements of local tradition accommodated within the imperial framework. This was characteristic Inca policy, not the erasure of local culture, but its incorporation and subordination to the Inca system. The result was a cultural blending visible in the archaeological record: Inca ceramics alongside Chachapoya ceramics, Inca architectural forms beside Chachapoya ones, the material signatures of two distinct traditions coexisting in the same sites. The mummies of Laguna de los Condores reflect this blending, wrapped in textiles that show both Chachapoya and Inca weaving traditions, interred according to practices that combined elements of both cultures, their bodies preserved in a cloud forest cliff niche that was entirely Chachapoya in its funerary logic. The Chachapoya was still under Inca authority, still resisting it in various ways, still maintaining aspects of their own cultural identity, when the world changed again. In 1532, a Spanish force of approximately 168 men under Francisco Pizarro landed on the Peruvian coast. Within 2 years, through a combination of military force, epidemic disease, and the exploitation of internal Inca political conflict, this small force had captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa, killed him despite the payment of an enormous ransom, and effectively destroyed the central authority of the Inca state. The collapse of the Inca Empire did not immediately bring peace to the Chachapoya region. What it brought was chaos, the breakdown of the imperial administrative system that had, whatever its oppressions, maintained a degree of order and stability, followed by the arrival of Spanish colonial authority, which imposed its own order with its own oppressions. The Chachapoya response to the Spanish arrival was initially to support the Spanish against the Inca. This was not an irrational choice. The Chachapoya had been conquered by the Inca within living memory of the Spanish arrival, had resisted that conquest repeatedly, and had specific grievances against Inca authority. An enemy of the Inca might be an ally, or at least a less immediate threat. Some Chachapoya communities provided active military assistance to the Spanish forces during the campaigns to consolidate the conquest. Chachapoya warriors fought alongside Spanish soldiers in battles against Inca loyalists who continued to resist in the Andean highlands for decades after the initial conquest. The Spanish, for their part, noted the Chachapoya with a particular kind of colonial appreciation. They were useful fighters, they seemed more cooperative than many Andean peoples, and the chronicle's descriptions of their light skin made them seem, through the distorting lens of Spanish racial categories, somehow more comprehensible than other indigenous peoples. But Spanish colonial rule brought its own catastrophe, regardless of any initial alliance. The demographic collapse that followed European contact was the most devastating event in the history of the Americas. The indigenous population of the Americas, which had been in the hundreds of millions before contact, fell by an estimated 90% over the century following 1492, killed primarily by diseases to which they had no prior exposure or immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Waves of epidemic disease swept through populations that had no prior exposure, killing not 10 or 20% of those infected, as these diseases did in Europe, where populations had centuries of accumulated partial immunity, but 50, 60, 70% in communities with no immune defenses at all. The Chachapoya were not spared. Their population, estimated to have been in the hundreds of thousands before the Inca conquest, collapsed catastrophically in the decades following Spanish contact. Communities that had maintained the cloud forest cities for centuries were suddenly too small to sustain them. Settlements were abandoned. Agricultural terraces fell into disrepair. The knowledge needed to maintain the complex infrastructure of Chachapoya civilization began to be lost as the people who held that knowledge died. By the early 17th century, the Chachapoya as a distinct cultural entity had effectively ceased to exist. The survivors had been absorbed into the colonial mestizo world, their language replaced by Spanish or Quechua, their traditional practices suppressed or forgotten, their distinctive material culture no longer being produced. The cloud forest reclaimed the cities, the mist closed over the circular stone buildings and the decorated friezes and the cliff tombs. And the Chachapoya became a mystery. The process of recovering the Chachapoya from historical obscurity has been slow, difficult, and ongoing. The first Europeans to describe the ruins of the cloud forest were Spanish colonial administrators and missionaries who occasionally ventured into the remote highlands and encountered the stone buildings overgrown by cloud forest vegetation. Their accounts are scattered and incomplete. The ruins were curiosities noted in passing, not subjects of systematic investigation. Scientific interest in the Chachapoya began in earnest only in the 19th century. The German explorer and naturalist Johann Jakob von Tschudi described Chachapoya sites during his travels in Peru in the 1840s. The French geographer Olivier Ordinaire visited Kuelap in 1887 and provided the first detailed description of the site to reach a wide European audience. But sustained archaeological investigation of the Chachapoya region began only in the 20th century and has intensified significantly in recent decades. Adriana von Hagen and Craig Morris produced the most comprehensive synthesis of Chachapoya archaeology in their book, The Cities of the Ancient Andes, 1998, drawing on decades of fieldwork to provide the first systematic account of Chachapoya culture and history accessible to a general audience. Federico Kaufmann-Doig, the Peruvian archaeologist who discovered both the Carrahia sarcophagi and led the rescue excavation at Laguna de los Condores, has spent much of his career working in the Chachapoya region, producing archaeological data that has fundamentally shaped the current understanding of the culture. More recent work has employed the full range of modern archaeological techniques. LiDAR, the laser scanning technology that has been so productive in revealing Maya cities beneath jungle canopy, has been applied to the Chachapoya region, revealing the extent of archaeological sites beneath the cloud forest vegetation that makes visual survey from aircraft nearly impossible. The results have been striking. LiDAR surveys of the Utcubamba Valley and surrounding regions have revealed hundreds of previously unrecorded sites. Circular building complexes, agricultural terracing, road systems, and other features that the cloud forest had hidden from ground-level detection. Ancient DNA analysis of mummies from the Laguna de los Condores collection and other sites is providing population genetic data that illuminates the biological history of the Chachapoya, their relationships to other Andean populations, their internal diversity, the genetic effects of the Inca conquest and forced resettlement. Stable isotope analysis of human remains, measuring the ratios of different isotopes of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen in bone and tooth material, is providing information about Chachapoya diet and mobility that direct archaeological evidence cannot supply. Where did individuals grow up? What did they eat as children? Did they move between communities during their lifetimes? The picture that is emerging from all of this work is of a civilization more complex, more geographically extensive, and more internally varied than earlier scholarship had recognized. The Lemebamba Museum, established in 2000 to house the materials recovered from Laguna de los Condores, has become a model for community-based archaeological practice in Peru and beyond. The museum is run in partnership with the community of Lemebamba, with local staff trained in conservation and interpretation, with exhibits designed to serve both visiting researchers and the local communities whose cultural heritage the collections represent. This model matters. The history of archaeology in the developing world has too often been a history of extraction, of materials removed to museums in Europe and North America, of knowledge produced for foreign audiences without benefit to the communities in whose territories the work was done. The Lemebamba Museum represents a different approach. The mummies of Laguna de los Condores are studied, they are conserved, they are accessible to researchers, and they remain in the community they came from, interpreted for the descendants of the people who made them. The Chachapoya as a distinct cultural entity did not survive the Spanish colonial period. Their language is gone. Their traditional architectural and artistic practices are no longer maintained. The specific beliefs and rituals that organized their religious and social life are not accessible through any living tradition. But the people are there, in the towns and villages of the Amazonas and San Martin regions of northern Peru. In Lemebamba, in Chachapoyas, in the smaller communities scattered through the cloud forest valleys, lived the biological descendants of the Chachapoya people. The genetic evidence from ancient DNA studies that have compared pre-Columbian Chachapoya remains with modern populations of the region confirms what oral traditions in some communities preserve: continuity of descent across the colonial disruption. These are not Chachapoya people in the cultural sense. They do not practice Chachapoya culture, do not speak the Chachapoya language, do not build circular stone buildings decorated with geometric friezes. They are Peruvian people with the complex cultural heritage of 5 centuries of colonial and post-colonial history, shaped by Spanish language and Catholic tradition and the economic and social structures of the modern Peruvian state. But they are the descendants, and the relationship between modern communities in the region and the archaeological heritage of the Chachapoya is not simply one of passive inheritance. It is active, contested, and in many communities, genuinely engaged. Local communities participate in archaeological fieldwork as laborers, guides, and increasingly as trained technicians and paraprofessional archaeologists. The Lemebamba Museum employs local staff. Tourism to Kuelap and other sites provides economic benefit to communities in the region, a benefit that creates direct material incentives for the preservation and careful management of the archaeological heritage. The cable car completed at Kuelap in 2017, bringing the site within reach of visitors who could not manage the previous approach road, was controversial in some archaeological circles concerned about the impact of increased visitor numbers on a fragile site. But it also represents a decision by the Peruvian state to invest in making the Chachapoya heritage accessible and economically productive for the region's communities. The tension between preservation and access, between protecting archaeological sites from the damage that visitor traffic inevitably causes and making those sites available to the public that funds their study and conservation, is not unique to Kuelap. It is one of the central challenges of archaeological site management everywhere. What makes the Chachapoya case particularly interesting is the possibility of a specifically local resolution, one in which the communities of the cloud forest take leading roles in managing their own heritage, making their own decisions about the balance between preservation and access, and capturing the economic benefits that heritage tourism can generate. The Chachapoya are not a solved problem. For every question that recent archaeology has answered about this civilization, new questions have been opened. For every site that has been located, surveyed, and partially excavated, the LiDAR data suggests dozens more waiting in the cloud forest. The full extent of the Chachapoya cultural area is still being mapped. New sites are being discovered every field season. The relationship between the major centers, Kuelap, the various cliff tomb complexes, the dozens of smaller settlement sites, and the overall political and social organization of the Chachapoya world is still being worked out. The Chachapoya language is gone, but tantalizing fragments survive in place, names and in the lexical borrowings that Quechua and Spanish made from it. Linguists working with these fragments are attempting to reconstruct something of the language's structure, to understand at least partially how the Chachapoya talked about their world. The full corpus of Chachapoya art, the geometric friezes of the buildings, the painted textiles, the decorated ceramics, has not yet been systematically documented and analyzed. The patterns and their variations across sites and across time potentially contain information about social organization, ritual practice, and cultural history that a systematic analysis could extract. The Ancient DNA Project, the systematic genetic sampling of Chachapoya mummies, is still in its early stages. The data being generated will eventually provide a detailed picture of Chachapoya population history, where the founding populations came from, how the population changed over time, what the genetic effects of the Inca conquest and forced resettlement were. And there are the sites that have not yet been found. The cloud forest of northern Peru covers an area of tens of thousands of square kilometers, much of it accessible only on foot, through terrain that makes travel slow and difficult. The LiDAR data has already revealed that the density of Chachapoya sites is much higher than previous surveys suggested. As LiDAR coverage expands and ground truthing of newly identified sites progresses, the full extent of what the Chachapoya built across their territory will become clearer. The mist has been hiding things for 500 years. It is beginning, slowly and reluctantly, to give them back. There is something about the Chachapoya that resists the usual frameworks of ancient civilization narrative. They were not conquered by their most immediate successors. The Inca conquest did not erase them, as the determined resistance and the cultural survival of the colonial period shows. They were not preserved by their most immediate successors. The Spanish colonial system and the epidemics it brought effectively ended the Chachapoya cultural tradition within a century. They are not accessible through a living descendant tradition in the way that Maya culture is accessible through the millions of Maya-speaking people of Mexico and Guatemala. There is no Chachapoya language being spoken today, no Chachapoya religious tradition being practiced, no direct cultural continuity of the kind that gives descendant community archaeology its particular moral and intellectual weight. What there is are the ruins, the circular buildings on the ridgelines, half hidden in the moss and the mist. The sarcophagi standing on their cliff face above the Utcubamba Valley, looking out over the landscape they have watched for 500 years. The mummies in the Leimibamba Museum their wrapped forms containing the biological remains of people who built cities in the clouds and placed their dead on cliff faces above the lake. And the cloud forest itself, still growing, still producing its extraordinary ecological richness, still wrapping the ruins of the Chachapoya in the perpetual white that their people had made their home. It is early morning above the Utcubamba Valley. The cloud has settled in overnight, as it always does, filling the valley to the brim and rising above the ridgelines on either side. The circular stone walls of the buildings emerge from the white at intervals, appearing, disappearing, appearing again as the cloud shifts and breathes. On the cliff face above the lake, the sarcophagi stand where they have always stood. The elongated figures, their exaggerated heads facing outward, see nothing in the mist, and see, perhaps, everything that the mist contains. The valley they were placed to watch, the forest that presses close on every side, the sky that is never quite visible. The geometric friezes on the building walls catch the soft light of the cloud morning. The diamonds and zigzags and stepped patterns that are the visual language of a people who are not here anymore, who left this vocabulary of forms as their clearest statement to the future. We were here. We made this. We found this cloud and made it our home. The birds are calling. Not the birds of a documented natural history. The specific birds of this specific place, the species found nowhere else, the evolutionary products of the cloud forest's long isolation, singing in the mist above ruins that have been here longer than any living thing remembers. 500 years of cloud have done their work. The Chachapoya are gone as a living tradition, as a spoken language, as a daily practice of circular buildings and cliff tombs and geometric art. But they are not entirely gone. They are in the ruins that the mist is slowly, reluctantly revealing. One lidar pass at a time, one field season at a time, one carefully excavated mummy at a time. They are in the mummies of the Lemebamba Museum, real people with real names that we will never know, preserved by the same cloud that hid their cities from the world for 5 centuries. They are in the descendants who live in the valley towns and the cloud forest villages, who may not speak the language or practice the traditions, but who carry in their bodies the biological continuity of the people who built Kuelap. And they are in the mist itself, the same mist that condensed on the limestone walls when they were new, the same mist that softened the outlines of the sarcophagi as their makers placed them on the cliff face, the same mist that closed over the abandoned cities when the last Chachapoya communities fell silent. It has been keeping them, waiting for us to learn how to look. Rest now. The cloud forest is breathing. The mist is settling into the valleys. The stone buildings are standing in the white. The sarcophagi are watching the valley they have always watched. And somewhere in the cloud, a bird is singing a song that has never been recorded. A song that belongs to this place. A song that the mist has been keeping. Good night.